recording? So, today we're going to be talking about conditioning, okay? Last time we talked about conditioning in its most basic form. We covered some ground rules as to how we can get some conditioning done. Today we'll be covering some of the more specific, more aggressive plays you can do with conditioning. But before we do that, let's take a little bit of time to actually kind of recap what happened last session. So we covered a couple of the first few things about conditioning. It's a concept. You need to be doing the same thing. You need to be doing the same thing repeatedly before it kicks in. Okay? Some of the ground rules that we touched on, some of the rules of thumb is that you have to make sure that you're doing it early, right? You got to understand that some utility is better than other pieces of utility. You got to understand that when the piece of utility is finite, like a Roomba, like a drone, that shows commitment. And generally speaking, when you're throwing utility into a site, it is more likely that a team will fall for that condition and will likely fall for that push if you throw more of that non-refundable utility. Different agents have different playstyles, so when you look at their kits, you have a different way in which you need to perform that condition. So for example, something like Sova can be done simply by not even showing presence, just showing utility. Whereas someone like Jet needs to be a little bit more present, a little bit more aggressive in how she shows presence in order to be able to do that condition. Okay, last but not least, we talked about some things like info denial. You got to make sure that when you're using that conditioning, you are also looking at ways of breaking those patterns. And we're going to be talking more about breaking those patterns on today's lesson. And last but not least, make sure that you're not just making noise. Once they're conditioned, it is much better to cut noise at the beginning of the round, because I find that players condition the opponent and then completely forget about it, and they default and they make noise, and it just means nothing anymore, right? So with those rule sets out of the way, right, we're going to be talking about some of the things that we talked about, that we were going to be talking about. So the first one is we're going to be talking about breaking conditioning, okay? So when we were talking about a particular push, I'm going to put random agents down. Okay. Let's say these three agents right here, they're coming in, they're trying to push site. And you start them up with a condition where you just throw this wall across. Okay. They're aware that this wall is coming. They've seen this wall. And when this wall tends to show up, they know that the second that drone happens, right around here, and Phoenix throws a flash, then that means that the push tends to happen, right? This is what lets them explode. The enemy team is kind of catching up on the idea that sometimes this wall doesn't mean much danger, and sometimes they can throw this drone out to catch the opponent off guard, right? If there's one thing that you guys need to know is there are two ways of giving information that might potentially give info denial, okay? Of course, we've talked about calling a bluff. Of course, they can call this, and we'll talk about how that's a counter to conditioning. But if you throw a piece of utility, so for example, this right there, at the beginning of the round, and this is a question for you guys, how can you guarantee that Viper is on A main? What is the biggest sign that she's there?
If her wall goes up right away, like when her wall goes up is when she's on A main.
Okay.
So
we're gonna set one condition down. Okay, we're gonna say that in order for her to be here, wall must be up. Okay, what else? Any other takers?
I mean, she threw it from there.
Right. She threw it from here, right? She threw it when walls. Well, I mean, I did say at the beginning of the round. Let's say one more time. Spawn walls were still up when this wall was thrown, right? At the beginning of the round, you're trying to figure out whether Viper is still here or not. Okay. What's something that would tell you, hey, she's still here? What's something that you would have to do to confirm? What's something that you
Use
would
utility?
You can use utility to respond. Good. What else?
You had somebody up on over by heaven hearing footsteps.
Okay, you can have someone around this area listening for noise. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, all of these are pretty good answers. Okay, but here's the thing. Unless, of course, we have that one particular player that uses utility or pushes up, we will never know. Okay? This person right here, we do not know. There is such a thing as this wall. I've also seen something like this been used. I don't know. I've seen a bunch of different things. I should even kind of specify as to why the walls are being used the way that they are. But when you're using any form of utility, we have to understand the concept of question marking. Okay? Question marking is the act of essentially creating a little space, a little piece of space on the map that basically creates a question mark on whether the enemy might be there or might not be there. The most basic way of thinking of this concept is back when Haven was a thing. This was a very popular dart. If you guys remember, Sova would start over here on A, would just throw the dart to confirm any information as any op might be pushing up, any person might be pushing into here, maybe someone might push up here, right? But just because the dart was thrown does not necessarily mean that Sova is still there. Sova could have rotated back, Sova could be waiting here as a lurk, Sova could be pushing up this way, right? The whole idea of the amount of options that Sova could be having creates a question mark. Another form of a question mark is, let's say, for example, Jet. Jet is turning over here, and she throws a smoke down for a cross. Unless someone confirms this information right here, this becomes a question mark because we no longer have vision on it, right? And this is how you can start using some form of conditioning to break the opponent in terms of not giving them information and using conditioning as a form of pulling rotations and making them uneasy. Okay? So if you combine this sort of technique with lurking, or maybe using the same piece of utility and then maybe look for an opportunity, you can create really good advantageous plays that maybe potentially some of the players that were not standing out on an aggressive play might show up. So we can bring back that split wall and we start to realize that maybe Viper wasn't doing too hot, but because of this question mark right here, not only can they still make the belief that they could be in this area, but they could also be here, potentially catching enemies off guard. In fact, I believe that this is a wall used in the PRX versus Gen. And what happened is the Sky tried to clear all this space, but was unable to catch a Viper crossing over into this area. And what ended up happening is they tried to double confirm the information, and they got shot from the back. Okay. So this is a good example of how conditioning can be used, okay, for this sort of play. So making sure that you have someone that can do the same piece of utility over and over again is really effective, okay? What about ultimates? Ultimates are the ultimate tool, except that they are very, very expensive, okay? Ultimates are very expensive. They are very likely to catch an enemy off guard. However, if you throw the ult by itself, it is not going to cause any sort of movement. There is a fake, there's a double fake, there's something you can do, there's a triple fake. Let me give you an example of how something might work. Pretend that the entire player base is over here. All 5 of you are about to push up. And what's happening is the enemy team knows that you're ready to push. In order for you guys to perform this play before around the early rounds, your KO was able to get his ult early. And what they did is they popped their ult immediately upon making noise to make it seem as though you guys are pushing up. So this creates the belief that this noise right here is now equaling some sort of play. The reason this works is because ults do not happen very often, and you do not have a second chance to kind of think, they're gonna fake it, right? Most of the time, your first reaction is to think that they're gonna be using the ult for the advantage. So in order for you guys to think about it this way in making plays, is that you can use this ult, make noise, and then have the opposing ult on the opposite side. It's very likely that if you start making noise over here, maybe you cut it, maybe you guys are fighting over here, and then you guys get repelled, maybe something can't happen, right? And then immediately upon hearing maybe some rotation, maybe some water, right? you start thinking, oh, okay, they're going to be over by B. And this ult happens, your brain starts thinking they're hitting B. However, little did you know that they used that condition against you because they were actually faking a rotation and they're still on A. This is a very popular play, especially with agents that are really, really good at creating a lot of noise. So KJ ult is really good. KO ult is pretty good. I would say breach ult, but breach ult is very scary to use because you could also just miss it. And some people tend to posture in a way where they'll try to counter it. So it doesn't really do much. You always have to follow it up with something, but it is something you can do. I suggest if you do something like this ult or this ult, you always have someone else next to you, simply because the effect of it on its own is not going to scare them, right? For example, in here, KJ ult, they have to leave, right? That's really, really scary. Whereas something like breach, I find that some people tend to be really cocky, especially in ranked, and they don't respect it as much. So we just have to keep that in mind when we're using these ults. Just something to kind of keep an eye on. But yeah, try to make sure that when you're playing, maybe in higher tiers, I mean, obviously in lower tiers, I wouldn't even encourage you guys to even use your ults for faking. It's really easy to just kind of take a site. But the second that you're through the metal ranks and maybe even reaching something like Ascendant, it starts becoming a little bit easier to now use fakes. So try to start using your ults to deceive opponents. Try to pay attention to that. Normally, it is encouraged for players to only use ults for fakes as a last resort, but because obviously there's too much value, right, in just losing the ult. So I kind of encourage you guys to kind of determine whether you guys want to use that fake early. And again, you gotta make sure that within the first 3 or 5 rounds, you guys are spending your time conditioning the opponent, no matter on attack and our defense, so you guys can set some sort of play style that the enemy will try to present back. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so that brings us back to posturing. Okay, so now we're gonna start looking into countering the opponent. This is actually something that a lot of players tend to struggle with, because if they get conditioned and they can't read the opponent, it starts becoming hard to kind of play back. So let's say you're in Ascent. We're going to be using a very, very easy tactic. So let's say, for example, the enemy has started rushing you guys down on A. Okay, this is very popular. They're just rushing you down on A. That this is very possible, happens a lot. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out whether you should kind of respond here with a stack, or you should respond with quick rotations and maybe have someone ready to rotate, right? But what's happening is, because of the success of their rush, you guys are on edge, right? At one point in time during the round, they're going to be using that condition to set lurks. And they're going to be doing something just like cutting noise. They're essentially giving you guys no information. They're depriving you. Again, they're using conditioning for info denial. How do you counter this in order to win your match? What is it exactly that you need to do to win a match in which you can't read whether the opponent is going to do their popular strategy or, do something else? How can you tell? How do you read that? And this kind of comes back to the question of, how do you read whether Viper's still there, right? Like, again, you wouldn't know, but there is a way. We kind of touched on it a little bit with the utility part, but there's a little bit more to it. Does anyone want to take a gander, maybe a chance? Anybody?
Take space.
Taking space, pretty good. Okay. How would you take space to respond back?
Like if they hit A like pretty much every round, and they conditioned you that they like to hit A, maybe you like put a couple people on B and push out B main to make sure they're not B main, and then the other 3 could like stay A, and then the people on B could push out through mid.
Okay, so pretty much we're doing a push out of all lanes. I would assume that, and I'm just going to try to clean it up. We play on contact. If something's happening here, we can essentially go for a pinch both lanes here to essentially hit back on the site where they might be. If we get nothing, I'd assume that the enemy team is just going to play around these areas, something or other, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that is 90% of the answer. So yes, congratulations. That's actually a really good answer. Okay. And the way that we're going to be breaking it down is by using posturing. So if you guys are familiar with League of Legends, there's a term called posture, right? You posture around objectives. It's very similar to that. It's pretty much the same thing. We're pretty much just trying to get aggressive. We're trying to make sure that we control one piece of the map. Okay. So a very popular strategy for players, for example, let's say they were rushing down over here, is to just put a one-way right there. But of course, what's happening is because of the conditioning, we start becoming really afraid of responding back. So a good example of this, again, we have this one way over there, but they push past it. They have really good flashes. There's nothing we can do. And this is where confidence starts becoming a huge problem. In order for you guys to posture, you guys need to regain your confidence. If you're in a tournament, you call a timeout. If you guys are in a game, in a normal match, you guys have to take one of your eco rounds and just try something. Okay? It is one of the rounds where you have no money, you have nothing to lose. You might as well try something and see if you can break that chain. To posture is very simple. You got to make sure that while you're playing, while you're taking some sort of space, you're making sure that you're creating a kill box. Okay? Posturing, if you were looking something like League of Legends, again, let's pretend that this is the pit by Dragon, right? By Drag. Basically what's happening is everybody's kind of setting some vision around the area. You're pretty much doing the exact same thing. Riot did not kind of screw up when it came to this. It's very similar in that regard. So we're going to bring this right here. Same example, right? This entire area right here is going to get, it's completely taken over. And we're going to create a kill box in one particular zone. And it's going to be right here. Or maybe your team has utility that helps them take over this. The point is you're creating a kill box. This is pretty much what you were saying, right? We're trying to push out, but we're trying to make sure we have some sort of intention around it, because I find that players that think they're doing the aggressive play, or they think that they're doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, right? They tend to kind of get scared. They tend to just stay here for a little bit and then just kind of leave. They tend to maybe, for example, Jet as an example right here tries to push out with dash, right? Really scared. In order for you guys to posture, you guys got to make sure that you have a kill box ready. And it's really easy to do. I've seen it done multiple times with characters that have mollies. So mollies is one of the easiest ways to kind of perform this type of strategy, because you got to make sure that there is a consequence to an enemy's push, right? So this is what happens when an enemy tries to push forward. If you guys have some sort of cross over here, maybe an enemy decided to push over there. We bait, perhaps Owen flashes around, right? But at the end of the day, confidence comes in because you need to be ready to take multiple fights at once. You need to make sure that they get punished for playing aggressively. And the kill box is essentially using a bunch of utility to respond back. There's other ways, of course, of doing this. I find that some players just tend to give up sight, and their way of posturing is, instead of posturing by this kill box, they kill box around here. And this is scenario 2. Let's say you want to play it more passively, right? You can, of course, instead of pushing out, instead of taking this space right here, you can instead talk about what we said in that second half of the answer, where we start taking over other areas. And what's happening is, it's pretty much what you were saying, right? But you said it all in one round. The reason you don't want to do it all in one round, at least in response to a rush, or at least a conditioned rush, is because if they cut noise, they're kind of playing on the idea that if they cut noise, you're going to push out, and it's very easy to punish players. I've seen this a lot of times with players that think that, oh, they're going to be on A, or, oh, we should test the waters to see if they're on A, and they're in one and dones, or they're in very sneaky corners, and they just hit you with an off angle, right? This is why you got to make sure that you make up your mind on whether you're going to posture around site, create a kill box here on the preferred site that they like to hit, or you create an uneven, fight wherever they like to hit first, which in this scenario, they've conditioned that is A main, right? If they did it towards B main, same thing. If they did it towards mid, again, you have 2 points of contact. Either you do it towards like early in the fight, so throw a flash early, maybe dash in, right? Maybe get aggressive with it. Oh, no pen. Or, of course, like we mentioned, you create a kill box down here. Really easy to flash around this corner, really easy to kind of block them off with a smoke. This is really common. This is where it starts just becoming, again, a battle of just confidence. If you can't hit your shots, then I don't think it's a matter of information, lack of information. It's not a matter of conditioning. There are some things you could do to make it easier, but if you're not hitting your shots at that point in time, you just have to reset your mental, right? If you guys are in the same rank, then you guys should be able to hit the same amount of shots. That is a technicality, but I'm not going to push too much on that because I know that there's some players that rely on game sense a lot and some players that rely on mechanics a lot. Those do exist. Okay, so that is an example of posturing towards aggressive defensive players, right? I do believe that I could push towards another example against really like defensive players. If you guys want me to do that as well, would you guys like me to show you that as well, or should I move on? Are you guys okay with what I got you with, or do you guys understand posturing at the very least?
I'd like to see
Oh.
the example.
Okay, the example. So we're gonna be talking about defense, and you're playing against a more aggressive team. Sorry, a more defensive team, right? So now you've kind of been so basically against defensive teams, they tend to be playing over here as a good example, right? If we were showing something like Breeze, the opponent essentially would be playing all the way back there. They'd just be looking for some sort of quick pick, maybe some sort of fight that you might give them for free, right? When they're playing defensively, they're doing it with the intention of extracting resources, right? The only way to really counter them, you could potentially still take the same idea to completely just take a zone. You can look at which site have they hit the most. But the problem with people that have conditioned you when they're playing passively is that the only way that they're going to get anything is if you give them the utility that they want, right? So a good example of this is they have given you no noise, okay? No noise, and you think that it is a good opportunity to maybe take orbs, right? Maybe it is a good opportunity for your duelist to kind of push up, get an idea of what's going on. Maybe we have a jet that gets a little sneaky and tries to jump on top of this area up here, right? Just examples of players that are basically taking space that has been given to them for free. That is a trap. If you ever find yourself playing against a defensive team on attack and they're winning rounds, that is because you guys are playing too aggressively into their traps. So the way that you guys have to think about the map is the second you step away from the zones you guys were given immediately or away from cover, you are now stepping into a trap. It is, of course, I'm not trying to make you paranoid, but that is technically how they want you to believe that the map and the state has been played. There's very few things that you could do, but there are some things that are really effective against, of course, these teams. Of course, the first one is not giving them anything. The problem is, of course, it's really hard to not give them anything because the second that they're ready to push a site, especially on something like Breeze, wall needs to go up or smokes need to go up. So it's really easy to kind of give away those smokes in multiple sites, right? So it's really easy to lose that utility. The best way that I've also found that players tend to play against these really passive teams is they like to do leaning sites. So what's happening is you split the map in half. And I've noticed that most of the time when they're successful, they do bring in that same idea against those aggressive teams that I talked about before, where they posture towards one particular site. So they posture aggressively and they create kill boxes towards site because that's the only place they can really hit. They're not really going to push out because they've been punished too many times before. And this way, they know that the second they start pushing in, they can actually show up with late utility. And they're okay with late utility, right? And then on the opposite side, we leave characters that are self-sufficient. So Cypher's a good example of this. This is why Cypher is really powerful on maps like Breeze, because you are not really in the tendency of leaving your site completely vulnerable, right? So that's one example. You would have a leaning site. The second one is you would respond very similarly to what you did in Ascent like this, but instead we take a little bit of the example that we talked about with, I think your name is Vop, right? You mentioned just kind of push out here, and if some response happens, maybe push out this way. Very similar to that. What you want to make sure that you're doing is if you're playing against passive teams, you're going to try to scale as much as possible, which might lead to some deaths. You're going to do the same thing, split the map in half, and try to scale to the point that you control one half of the map, or at the very least, you are safe or tradable in one half of the map. Meaning that this half of the map would contain 4 players, and you might leave your poor KJ on B, or Cypher, or your Sova, who knows. You would leave them by themselves, and they would use the reusable utility to give you information while you control this part of the map. And this is how you would posture yourself against these teams that are conditioned, have conditioned you that they like to play slow, right? So that's how it goes that way. Of course, they didn't really cover too much of attack. Generally, there's really no conditioning that you can really be dealing with for defensive players. The main conditioning that you might expect is the same idea, of course. They might attack aggressively. They might wait back. You could just have to think about this vice versa. The same concepts apply. So if they're playing aggressively here, you would create a kill box, right? Same thing. Or if you know that they're going to be pushing out this way, again, you create a kill box, or you just wait for that utility to be wasted. Last but not least, if they're playing back and they're playing passively, they're just waiting for you to step in those areas and just get those kills for free. So you want to make sure that you're not giving them, the satisfaction of wasting your utility before it's time to hit the site. You want to make sure that you are scaling. On attack, it's a little bit easier to scale, and try to not fall again for those same off angles. Make sure that you're safe and you're tradable. Okay, again, same concepts still work there. Does that make sense for everybody? Does posturing on both an attack and on defense make sense? Does that help you kind of understand how you would deal with coordinated teams that tend to do a good job of conditioning the opponent? Does that make sense? Any questions?
No, sir.
No? Perfect.
No.
Okay. We're going to talk about one last topic, and that is alternating between plays. This is the one that gets players the least excited because they don't really know how to properly do it. There is normally not that many ways of conditioning a team and using that as a way to respond. So these are 9 rounds, and each one of these rounds will show some form of what we're doing with that, right? So let's say you've conditioned them on the first 3 rounds that you like to push A, okay? And this is just like rush A. So we're going to put RA as rush A, okay? So we're going to be using RA as our example of how you would use this to change plays while keeping the same theme going, okay? And we're going to be doing it by putting fractions in there, and I will help you understand. So let's say on round 1, after like round 3, right? So round 4, technically, you decide to rush A again. At this point in time, this is expected, right? And if you were to continuously do this and you went RA and RA, well, this is becoming too predictable. Alternating plays helps us break that pattern and break that chain, which is why after 3 rounds, they're bound to expect it. If you've ever heard of someone, they're never going to expect it for 3 rounds in a row, they're kind of right. There is a point to be made there. And it's just a matter of how coordinated you are to execute that play and how good your aim is, right? Because you might be falling into a trap. They might have read your play. So this is how conditioning is going to work. Once you've done the 3rd play, you have a couple options. You can do a half push and leave a lurk. This is a really popular play. People tend to take space. They know they're going to respond. These guys fail to posture. You've now taken all of A main, and then you stop pushing. What does that really mean, right? They would say, okay, well, they're just here. Maybe they got delayed because of the smoke. Maybe they got delayed because of all of that. That's what happened, right? You can do half a push. You can leave a lurk. The second round is you could do maybe potentially half a push and then cut noise, right? Very similar to lurk, but just going to put an N, no N, right? You just cut noise, right? A different example of how you can alternate the play. Another example is you could just do normal RA, right? You could just simply continue with the rush no matter what. We're an aggressive team, guys. Let's just keep running. Oh, there's some molly there. It's just KJ molly. That's not going to kill you. Push through, right? It's something like that, right? We can do things like no pushes, right? Just cutting noise, or potentially not even push this site. Maybe push another site, right? This is an example of how you can use your conditioning to your advantage. So we basically have half pushes over here. Very similar to fakes. You could basically use it as a fake on one. You can use it as a lurk for the other, right? You can use it as a way to give a feint to the opponent. Basically a play where you just actually continue with it. They wouldn't expect it 4 rounds in a row, right? And what you're going to be doing with all of these is that you can continue doing all of this. And then with these half pushes, you can just send the first piece of utility that you send on that push. So maybe it was KO Flash. It lands right there. And that was the first step of the push. KO's by himself. Okay. We have a fake, right? We had half pushes there before. We're kind of rotating off. We're kind of getting them to posture. We leave. Well, this one's different. We just have one player do it, or enough players do it, right? And basically, we can continue down the line of rounds and continue doing that more. And we're going to notice that. Oh, boy. It's lagging. Yeah, at least the recording isn't, it looks like. Okay. And what you're going to find yourself with is that you could find rounds where you're doing the conditional thing that you're doing, and then you'll do a round where you're doing no conditions, and maybe you'll do a round with a lurk, and then you'll do a round with no conditioning again, and you'll continue to do this once the condition has been set, because the second that this condition has been set, it doesn't really matter what you do, they have to respect it, right? Of course, it becomes really easy to think, oh, they're not really going to fall for that. And yeah, you can kind of give that respect to the opponent, but when you do that, you lose rounds. You just have to be confident in what you're making, because at the end of the day, I can promise you, even at the highest tier of play, some things just go their way just because, okay? And that's the thing that I will teach you guys when we're covering IGLing. Sometimes it's a gut feeling, and there is nothing that you can use to explain why that works the way it does, okay? If I had to put an Ascendant player to carry Iron players, he's going to do something really, really stupid. And if I were to ask him why, he just says, just because, right? I can do it. And that's basically the whole point of it. You're trying to make sure that you can kind of take on the brunt sometimes and maybe even play an upwards battle.
Hi.
And you can still take that fight. Someone was talking? Hello? Maybe not. Okay, so with that out of the way, that basically covers the second half. We basically covered a little bit of that information denial, give you guys a little bit of a recap, but we mainly focused on talking about ultimates, talking about how that info denial can be really useful, and we talked a lot about posturing. That was a huge part of it, right? And then, of course, alternating between plays. Don't be afraid to make a variation of the play that you already did before. We talked a little bit on the first session on how you can use different pieces of utility to kind of pull the push and create a fake. Use that information to alternate between plays. Maybe you change how much you're sequencing on that push. Maybe instead of using 3 pieces of utility, you use 4 and then you rotate off. Or maybe you only use 2 pieces of utility and then you push regardless, right? So as long as you have variations of that condition, you will have them completely baffled. And that basically concludes the class. Okay. Thank you guys for that. Do you guys have any questions again before I close this off?
Not me.
End the recording real quick.
Well, just yet. Not just yet. No questions?
No, sir.
When you're conditioning the opponent, like, does it have to be like really obvious that it's a condition, or could it just be like one piece of utility in one spot, and then they think like, oh, if that happens, then he's gonna play there for like one person?
Well, you got
Does
to
it have to
remember,
apply to the whole team?
you weren't there for the first class, right? So one of the
Yeah.
things that we talked about is depending on the piece of utility, sometimes it's not even going to be enough. So we talked about something called calling a bluff. Okay. So let's say, for example, on Ascent. Yeah, let's keep going on Ascent. I mean, it's the map we've been talking about. At the beginning of the round, we throw a knife right there, right? It could render the jet here useless. It could deal with maybe an Omen that's playing here, unable to throw the smoke, right? You name it. Problem is, not all pieces of utility are equal. So if we were to be looking at this knife right there, they could call a bluff. They could call the bluff that this is the only piece of utility that's being used. Okay? So what could happen is we can still have the one way. That knife can still happen. One knife alone is not enough to tell us and indicate to us that that push is going to still happen, right? And this is why you find players. In fact, I will bring back Haven because again, it's really, really popular, or at least was really popular. They would throw like something right there. They would kill it. Again, no consequence. There's really no commitment being shown because this dart comes back. They did it at the beginning of the round. They might be using it later in that round, right? Calling that bluff would be just to essentially try to take this space as if that dart never really happened. And you did it with the intention of confirming and maybe catching an opponent off guard. So to go back to your question, right? You were basically saying, is one piece of utility really enough? Usually when you're looking at how you're going to make that fake, you got to have a bunch of different utility at once in order to really make it feel like you're going to commit. And this is why we talked a lot about that rule of thumb that some pieces of utility are better than others. Because let's say, for example, you throw one flash here, right? That's whatever. It's just one flash. You throw a second flash right there. Okay, well, they're throwing two flashes. They just wasted two flashes, right? This little space right here is not really doing much. But the second that you throw one flash right there, and then you dog, and then you take up to this space, and then you flash up here, well, that's showing that you really want this space, right? That's showing way more. Well, not I was going to say coordination, but I shouldn't have said that. Not coordination, commitment, right? It's showing a lot more commitment. It's showing the idea that you really want this space. You're fighting for it. You're getting information. And that's really what matters. And when I talk about utility, I always tell players that it is not ideal for one person to use everything. So when you look at sequencing, if you look at any pro play, you're going to realize that they use one piece of utility and then somebody else takes this with another piece of utility and then someone takes this with another piece of utility, right? That's why you'll have maybe, for example, a flash here, and maybe you'll have like a dart right there clearing this, and maybe a dash, right? And then you'll follow it up with a flash, right? This is why you have that sequencing, because you want to make sure that one person is not carrying all the work, because then you'll have situations where one person will die and they'll still have all their kit together, right? So that's kind of the reason why you want to cascade utility one between the other, and it is how you can basically use that same cascading to show commitment, right? The more utility used, the more it is. And that's why I talked about that conditioning thing. Once you've conditioned them enough that this flash and this dog equals danger, you don't have to throw that extra flash to really show them the push. This is all they need, right? So that's the idea. So you really can't do it with just one. You just have to show that commitment. If you run it down with your knife, maybe, but that's against opponents that are afraid of you a lot, I would just say. But most of the time, that's not enough. I hope that answers the question. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, go for it.
So you can condition on defense too, right? Like on Lotus on A site, Raze almost always nades A site.
Yep.
For the push.
This is one example of the enemy conditioning you into thinking that this area is unsafe, with the intention, of course, taking something like rubble, right? This is a good example of conditioning. And most of the time, teams either fight back by pushing through and becoming more aggressive, creating a kill box right there with a bunch of utility, essentially fighting back, posturing this area, or they posture this area over here knowing that this space is too dangerous, but they're waiting for any other push. And this is why they tend to mostly default and hold this area. So yes, you're right. They can definitely condition. And like I said, the same things apply with how you would respond. So yeah, you're completely right. All right, I'm going to close it here. Let's get started. We have 15 minutes. We're going to warm up for anybody that's here. I'm going to create the lobby. Again, I'm just going to leave the party code. And if anyone wants to watch, just let me know. All right, I'm going to close this off.